This comes from the thinker René Girard, and what he basically argues is an explanatory argument. He's saying, look, you go back to any culture, and you're going to find human sacrifice and then rituals of animal sacrifice, right? You're going to find these cultures, their archaic religions, as we call them, has some moment of sacrifice at its center, and this seems to be important for maintaining the peace and unity of the community that performs these sacrifices. So really what he's trying to do when Girard looks at the world, he's saying, like, look, we have a big blind spot when it comes to understanding our world, because we don't have a unifying theory of why human beings are those type of animals that need to ritually kill something as part of their culture. So he's like, this demands an explanation. You can't just be like, yeah, we used to sacrifice things and now we don't. So he posits something, I think, very realistic. It's a very realistic argument, which is that these sacrifices are repetitions of real murder. So communities living after the fall are united not by simply like a common good, but actually perversely by a common enemy. So what brings people together is that distinction of the enemy. And Girard argues that this distinction is realized in ritual sacrifice. So you gather together, you remember some original killing of the other, of the outside, of the enemy, and maybe that takes the form of an actual human sacrifice, as it has and still does in many communities. Maybe it takes the form of an animal sacrifice. Maybe it takes the form of some other sacrificial ritual. But this is at the basis of humanity. And in a certain respect, the story of the Bible takes this up, right? You have priests in the Bible, right? And the priests are those who offer sacrifice. And it's important to realize that even as Catholics, when we have this idea of the priesthood, and it's very normal, it's very much priests are part of our life, we know them, we know Father Jim, but the priesthood is not disassociated from this sacrifice, from the one who offers sacrifice. This is the meaning that priesthood has had in all cultures and civilizations, and it is very important for Catholics to understand and reckon with that fact. What is different about the Catholic priesthood if it is still somehow involved with sacrifice?
So that takes us to Christ's own self-sacrifice. So instead of creating unity at the expense of a victim, of a scapegoat, we ourselves are to unify around Christ's own sacrifice and participate in it. And through our participation in pouring ourselves out like a drink offering, as St. Paul says, it is in that one body of self-giving that we find true unity. So there's a proper undoing of what is done in every other pagan sacrificial system, including, in a sense, the sacrificial system of the old law.
Yeah, so what you have is a long process of moving from the sacrifice of others to the sacrifice of oneself. And if you look at Western culture today, we recognize innately, powerfully, that the only acceptable sacrifice is a self-sacrifice, right? No one would be lauded today for sacrificing another person, right? And in fact, this is such a powerful difference that this change in priesthood and sacrifice has made on our culture, that it is more powerful in our culture to be a victim. In certain respects, it's more powerful to say, I am experiencing oppression, injustice. I am that other that is cast out. I am a scapegoat. I am a victim. Because in the Christian West, this evokes the pity and love of others. We must help the victim. We must be on the side of victims, right? We see this even in silly ways where people are trying to gather victim status when none really exists, but it points to how important of a change this was, because this is not something that existed in the ancient world.
Right.
There wasn't pity for victims. It was not a virtue. It was a weakness. But the historical account is obvious. This was a hard-won achievement. This was something that began, Girard puts the first moment And maybe it's important to kind of really quickly walk through this progression so that we don't want to run away with the idea that Christ, comes into this child slaying world and simply says, okay, no more, right? He has to draw people out of these habits of sacrifice. And so
the paradigm itself has to shift, and that takes time.
Totally. I mean, you see it in your own life, right? Like the raising a child to think of others before himself takes a long time. And so the idea that it wouldn't take a long time for a people, that'd be ridiculous. So in the Jewish people, you have a kind of grand experiment, as it were. Like God takes a people to himself and says, I'm going to teach you to sacrifice yourselves and not others. I mean, this is just one way to describe salvation history. And when you see it most clearly is in, I think, two moments that we mentioned in our article. The first is in the replacement of, so God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. Mm-hmm. And it's really important to realize that this wouldn't actually have been some strange, bizarre thing for God to ask. So a lot of the times we have this story of Abraham where it's like, it was the ultimate test of faith because how could anyone do this? Okay, but in actuality, I'm not saying it wasn't extremely difficult, but it was a custom. Throughout the entire Bible, God is commanding, do not offer up your firstborn sons. I have never thought of doing this. I've never thought of this thing, so don't do it. It was a part of the nations that surrounded the Jewish people was the custom of sacrificing firstborns. And this is described in different ways, offering them up to Moloch, making them pass through the fire. So when God asks Abraham to sacrifice his firstborn son, the really alarming thing is suddenly like, God, are you like those other gods of the other nations? Do you desire sacrifice? Right? And then right at the moment when I think the fear is greatest, that God is in fact one who desires blood, the story turns. And an angel is sent to prevent Abraham from sacrificing Isaac. But what doesn't happen is the angel does not then give a discourse on why sacrificing victims is bad. What happens is God provides a ram, and the ram is sacrificed. And so in this story, you have a movement from human to animal sacrifice. So it's remedial. It's like a de-escalation. It's like, okay, step down. God realizes, I think, God realizes that the sacrificial habit is so intense that we're not going to just be able to kick it cold turkey. And he gives a ram, to be the sacrificial victim. And yes, it's true. This has tons of, there's so much theological meaning in this. And we should be clear that sometimes when people hear Girard and this sort of theory, they think, oh, you're just narrowing down on one aspect. And I think to an extent we are, but it's an extremely important aspect. Like this is a real part of salvation history. So there's that moment, right? The movement from human to animal sacrifice. But then there's another de-escalation of the sacrificial order that comes. And it's in the prophets. When the prophets, and really in the Psalms as well, but when the prophets and the psalmist, they both start to realize in their different ways that God doesn't desire even animal sacrifice. There's those phrases like, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Mm-hmm. Or the psalm that says, were I hungry, I would not tell you. Do you think I drink the blood of bulls? God is being sort of sarcastic with his people. Like, you need to realize that I don't desire this sacrificial regime positively. You needed it because I'm weaning you off of human sacrifice. Right. But I don't desire it. Yeah.
And this really comes to right after Saul makes the great mistake of conquering a foreign people and sacrificing their animals, their cattle, instead of his own. Because at that point, it seems as if Saul does believe that God likes the sacrifice of animals positively in and of itself, and not as this understanding that, well, I own these animals. I feed off of them. This is my livelihood. This is part of the way in which I live. I own this. I mean, we all know this feeling of when you own something and have to give it up. It's like there's a part of you, there's a relationship with that object, with that thing that you actually cherish. And that being able to separate yourself from it so that you make room for God, and so that you are in a certain sense sense, a sacramental sense almost, habituating yourself towards rendering all of yourself to God Most High. Saul forgets that in this moment. He sacrifices something that he has no relationship with, that he does not really have a long-standing ownership of, to actually have those cherished habits in his soul, in a profound relationship with the cattle, and certainly not cattle that he lives off of.
Yeah, right.
And it's right after this that the Psalms and the prophets start to have this realization: oh, God doesn't want this positively in and of itself. He wants it for our sake, for our own sake, so that our habits might be turned towards self-giving, towards Him.
Right. Yeah, no, that's awesome. And it really comes to a head, this training in self-sacrifice. It comes to a head before the New Testament. When Christ comes, it's important to recognize that even though we're talking about a certain preparation of people's hearts, it's not the case that this is simply another quantitative step, right? Because Christ doesn't merely come as a teacher to say, okay, you've had some initial training, now let's show you why only self-sacrifice is the acceptable form of sacrifice. Christ is establishing a priesthood that is being weaned off of sacrifice in contradistinction to all the priesthoods of the world. This is a really important point, because it's not the case that what a priest is one who self-sacrifices rather than sacrifices others. It's the case that the priesthood that God establishes subverts the order of priesthood in all the other nations. It's a holy priesthood that is set apart precisely to undo all other priesthoods of the world. And this is the priesthood that Christ enters into to transform it once again in his incarnation when he becomes our high priest. Which means, and we'll get into this, that the Catholic priest is by nature always still subverting this tendency to the sacrifice of others. And we'll talk a little bit about how that practically happens. But Christ puts a kind of finality to this dynamic like withdrawal from sacrificial addiction. He kind of puts a cap on it by himself becoming the victim and the priest. Right? So Christ dies on the cross for our sake. Christ becomes the victim for our sake. But he does it willingly. He says this, that he goes to the cross, right? So when this happens, when Christ does this, we now have to acknowledge that the only true sacrifice is that kind of sacrifice, the sacrifice of bringing oneself to the cross. The only true priesthood is one that participates in that form of sacrifice. It's not that sacrifice is eradicated. It's that it is turned on its head. We're still called to sacrifice. It's just that the object of our sacrifice in the light of Christ is ourselves.
Right. And here we really want to make sure that it's not misunderstood that we're saying that the Holy Mass is just a sign or a way of subverting through symbol merely the priesthoods of pagan nations in the rest of the world. But rather, this is something very actual, that when we pray, that our sacrifice might be acceptable to God Most High, that we are truly offering Christ to the Father again, but in consuming Christ, it is him who is still being offered to the Father, and thus him who is in us, and thus us who's being offered to the Father. So something very, very real is happening at that moment.
And likewise, the unity is real. We call the sacrifice of the Mass Holy Communion. So a new form of unity is achieved where we are together, not because a common hatred of the victim, but a common love for the victim who died for our sake.
Right.
And that is real. That's a real infusion of grace into our souls, where to the point that, if you wanted to be very on the nose about it, after Christ, humanity only really has two choices. They'll either be unified over sacrificial victims, or they'll be unified through the Holy Mass. And there's no third way except for chaos and violence.